Welcome back. In this final part of the chapter, we'll be covering Learning Objective 2.4 for PSY 235 Social Psychology. This learning objective involves talking about how social psychologists and any researchers, for that matter, who use human beings in their research, how do they ensure their safety and welfare while still being able to pursue their scientific interests. Ethical issues in psychology have always been with us. That said, we have not always had policies and procedures in place that require researchers to show that they're exhibiting ethical practices. In the early days of social psychology, and social psychology is relatively young if you really think about all of the history of psychology, but there are studies like the one pictured here of Stanley Milgram's famous obedience to authority studies, which really caused psychologists and the world of science in general to take a step back and say, what are we doing here? To take a further step back, even before Milgram even imagined doing his studies of obedience to authority, the experience of the world in World War II, and particularly the Nuremberg trials, really highlighted the problem in science the world around. The Nazi regime really kind of sponsored, if you will, research using people who were forced into the concentration camps as subjects without their consent, without their willingness, without informing them of what they were going to be experiencing, and they treated them horrifically. It was monstrous. And that really, one of the outgrowths of that experience was the determination that researchers need to agree to a code of ethical conduct when they're engaged in research with human subjects. Now, there's also an analogous set of ethical principles for non-human participants as well. We're going to focus on humans in this discussion, though. So there's that longer history. It was several years, medical researchers adopted the ethical standards sooner than psychology. Psychology came in a little later. One of the motivating factors were studies like Stanley Milgram's or Philip Zimbardo's, which really kind of torqued the public consciousness and said, wait a minute, why should a researcher be allowed to do that to people? Isn't that dangerous? Isn't that problematic? And yeah, it's problematic. So social psychologists we are charged to be concerned with the welfare of our research participants. So we have to work with an IRB, an institutional review board, to have every study that we're going to conduct reviewed by our peers, but also by people who are general community members who can make a determination as to whether what we're asking our participants to do is reasonable and safe. Researchers, we have this ultimate goal that we want to make discoveries that can be useful, that can make people's lives better. But we can't pursue that goal if it means hurting people along the way. So, we want to create these vivid environments, these memorable environments. Like Milgram, he wanted people to really believe that they were hurting people in his studies of obedience to authority. He has to make it realistic enough. But the question you have to ask yourself as a researcher is the value of the discovery. Does that offset the potential dangers that I might put my participants in? And that's really the ultimate question. So one of the things that we are required to do in order to protect the rights of our participants is to inform them of what they're going to be experiencing. So we do what's called informed consent. I'm sure you've had many experiences with consent forms in your lives, and my guess is you didn't read most of them. I would encourage you to do so because informed consent forms are designed to protect you. The ethical dilemma that we have, we want to do research that's powerful. We want to do research that gives us good answers, reliable answers. At the same time, though, it's a dilemma because we don't want to hurt people. And there's always a trade-off there. So one of the things we do to mitigate that risk is to inform people. So what the researcher is required to do is to explain to participants what they're going to be experiencing. We don't always have to tell them what our hypotheses are, but we have to tell them what tasks they're going to be engaged in and what it's going to involve. If participants are made fully aware of some kinds of experiences, without, exposing the full hypothesis, and they say, yep, I'm willing to do it. So, one example that I'm thinking of just off the top of my head, there are these research studies that looked at pain tolerance. These were some classic neuroscience studies. And the measure of pain involved sticking your hand in an ice bucket, a bucket of ice. Some of you who are athletes, you're like, I stick my whole body in ice. I know all about this. Well, sticking your hand in a bucket of ice, eventually it's going to cause pain. So these early studies of pain tolerance, the informed consent form says, as a part of this study, you're going to stick your hand in in a bucket full of ice for as long as you can stand it, to a maximum of X number of minutes. And that is one way of resolving the ethical dilemma that's associated with potential risks to participants. Another kind of risk that you have to think about, I mentioned in the last slide, we don't always have to tell our participants why we're doing what we're doing. We just have to tell them what they're doing. So one of the things we may do is hide the real reason we're doing the research in the first place. So Milgram, he doesn't tell his participants that they're studying the willingness to inflict violence on another human being at the behest of an authority figure. He doesn't tell them that. He tells them a cover story. The cover story is, we're here to study the effect of punishment on learning words. Cover story. So that's deception. Now, what's the trade-off here? I need to lie to my participants so that their knowledge of my hypotheses will not change their behavior. How do I offset that lie? How do I offset the damage that I do by lying to my participants? So on the consent form, I tell them exactly what behaviors they're going to engage in. I just don't tell them why, and I may even give them a cover story. So what I'm doing is being deceptive. Sometimes this is necessary to hide that hypothesis so that you don't bias subjects' behaviors in a direction that you don't predict. So sometimes participants need to be told some contrived version of the events so that you can protect the integrity of the study. Deception in social psychology is really, really common. It typically involves just hiding the true purpose of the study until the study is over. We only use this if it's the only way that we can test a hypothesis. When we do it, we are required to do something called debriefing after the fact. So after the study is over, we present the research participants with a complete explanation of the hypotheses driving the study, why deception was used, and the ultimate goals of the research. Now, I mentioned that the impetus for this movement to have real ethical reviews started with lots of research, or lots of changes post-World War II, where we're looking at really protecting the rights of people when they're involved in biomedical and behavioral research projects. The founding document is called the Belmont Report, and it established the ethical principles and guidelines for protecting human subjects. And psychologists follow these guidelines. The American Psychological Association, which is one of our two major professional associations, argues that we are required as researchers to ensure the dignity and safety of research participants. And these ethical guidelines are tethered to your ability to actually conduct your research. So any institution, that includes Mount Union, we get federal funding of various forms. Specifically, if I wanted to get federal funds to do my research, I would absolutely have to do this. But now the law as written, if any institution takes federal money and research takes place at that institution, they have to follow the federal guidelines for ethical treatment of research participants. So we do. The IRB, the Institutional Review Board, has to have at least one scientist, at least one non-scientist, at least one person not affiliated with the institution that you're working at. They review all research proposals and they decide whether the ethical guidelines are met. Any aspect of the procedure that the committee thinks are too stressful, too upsetting, too likely to damage the person psychologically, cognitively, physically, or otherwise, they can demand that the researcher change them, or they can simply deny that the study be conducted at all. Now, this is a screenshot of some of the ethical principles. They're selected because they're the most obviously connected to the research done in social psychology. There are a lot of ethical principles that are associated with clinical practice. So those have been left out here. These are the ones that are really kind of tied to ethics in research. So the first principle really talks about accurate, honest, truthful reporting in science, as well as in teaching and practice. Psychologists are expected to respect the value and worth and dignity of all people, their rights to privacy, their rights to confidentiality and self-determination. When we conduct research, in whatever form, informed consent is required. When obtaining informed consent, we have to give certain pieces of information. We have to explain the purpose of the research, how long it's going to take, and what procedures are going to be used. We have to give people the right to decline to participate and to withdraw at any point in time. We have to explain any foreseeable impacts that their willingness to participate has, like potential risk, discomfort, adverse effects. We have to disclose the benefits of the research to the participant. We have to explain how confidentiality is going to be maintained. We have to explain, are there any incentives for your participation? So for college students, that's often extra credit or course credit. And finally, we have to provide easily accessible access to people who can answer questions about the research and their rights as participants. As psychologists, we have an obligation to take precautions to protect confidential information. So like if I have physical signed copies of consent forms with people's names on them, and I have their physical data, I have an obligation to keep those under lock and key. Literal lock and key. If everything is electronic, I need to make sure that it is not accessible by parties outside of my lab. So I have a responsibility to do that. If I use deception, I have to debrief, and I have to have reasonable justifications for that in the first place. I also need to provide opportunities for participants to ask questions, to get information about the nature, results, and conclusions of the study. So if I do a piece of research and then, 6 months later I've written it up, if one of my participants contacts me and says, I would like to see the results of the study, I am ethically obligated to share that information with them. And that concludes my coverage of Chapter 2.